So, here at Crete, not had a pay increase uh, years. Probably the last significant pay increase was during Trump's first administration. You know, there hasn't been a significant pay increase since then. I think, and I, I look at this and I think it's a shame on the company or on the industry for not paying the drivers more. No, inflation went up. Some estimates or low estimates will says inflation went up 9 or 10%. It probably was much higher than that because they take out things like the cost of food and fuel, the things that cost the most. They take out of the equation. It's always a con game, right? So inflation's gone up, but wages haven't gone up. So let's say, for example, you get a 5 cents per mile pay increase. Based on 100,000 miles, that's $5,000 for the year. Okay. But if inflation goes up by 10%, that's like 10% of 100,000 miles is like 10 cents per mile. You took a 10-cent pay increase decrease because inflation went up. You didn't get a raise, but inflation went up, but you didn't get a raise. And you would like to get a raise, and what you get instead is an explanation of how you can make more money. This comes back to the gamification of trucking. Okay, well, if you want a raise, here's how you make more money. You drive more miles, and you qualify the bonus. You know, if you drive over 30,000 miles for the quarter, you get the 4 cents per mile pay increase. So, complaining and drive more miles. Well, even 4 cents per mile increase on the bonus doesn't make up for the 10 cent per mile decrease from inflation. So that argument kind of falls flat. Drive more miles, make more pay. Well, that argument falls flat because inflation went up by 10%. You took a 10 cent per mile pay cut, and the bonus is only, if you drive that many miles, the bonus will only give you 4 cents of it back. So you're still down 6 cents per mile. That's $6,000 per year. How many years in a row has that gone on? Probably 4 or 5 years that you didn't get a pay increase. Now, I guarantee you, dollars to donuts, those same CEOs got a pay increase every single year. So they tell you can't get a pay raise, but I guarantee you they got a pay raise. So, and it's perfectly normal for people in the office to get at least 3% annual pay raise every single year to offset the cost of inflation. That's like an industry norm. If you have an office job and you have your annual performance review, the standard pay increase year over year is 3%. So if you just did an average job, you're getting 3%. For a driver, 3% would be like 3 cent per mile increase every single year. So if you haven't got an increase in the last 4 years and it's 3 cents per mile every year, that's 12 cents per mile less that you're not getting. That you probably should have got. Now, inflation went, the inflation took 10 cents per mile out of your pay. But if you had a 3 cent per mile increase every year, 2 to 3% every single year. Every single year, the office employees get an annual performance review, and if they do an average job, they get the standard 3% bump in pay. You don't get it; they get it. CEO got it. CEO probably got a lot more than 3%. He probably got more like 5 or 10%. But they come up with a lot of explanations, a lot of excuses of why the drivers aren't getting paid. Here's a classic excuse. I've heard all these excuses. The classic excuse is that, well, we can't pay the drivers any more than what the customer is willing to pay. That's a classic. That belongs in the Hall of Fame of excuses. you know, um, that they negotiate rates every year, right? And they're of course they're not going to show you the books. That's part of the game, the shell game, right? Try to find the nut. The shell game is they will never show you what the customer is paying, but they always tell you the customer is not paying no more, even though inflation has gone up and the cost of doing business has gone up. If the cost of doing business has gone up, you're going to pass that cost on to your customer. Now, they could go to the customer and say, okay, our cost went up by, 5%. So they get a 5% increase in the the shipping charge. And then they turn around and tell drivers that they can't get a pay raise because customers are not willing to pay. Now, who's fooling who? You know, you know, you have to take their word for it because you don't have access to the books. They say they're not getting more from the shipper. That's meaningless unless you show us the data. I mean, we're just supposed to take your word for it. Okay, that's how you want to play the game. And then that's the first one. The in the Hall of Fame of excuses is the customer's not willing to pay more. The next excuse that is in the Hall of Fame of excuses is drive more to earn more. You want more pay, drive more. Can't give you more pay unless you're more productive. So it's kind of a bad argument because they have a pay schedule that rewards senior drivers, years of service. And the junior guys get paid less than the senior guys, but they're hauling the same freight. So a junior guy hauling 3,000 miles per week is going to be paid less than a senior guy hauling the same freight, same 3,000 miles per week. So they are rewarding years of service, guys that stick with them. But this idea that they can't pay more is false. They do pay more. They pay the senior guys more. So you know I think it's a false argument that they can't pay more. That you have to drive more in order to earn more. I don't think that's true. Now, the third Hall of Fame excuse is that you gotta improve your efficiency. You gotta tighten up your availability. You gotta have the hours of service available, and you have to make the effort to communicate to your asset manager that you're available. Even though you've told them 5 times you're available, you gotta do it. You gotta call and tell them again you're available. It's like, I'm available, I'm available, and still you're gonna wait. It's never on the company that it's their fault that you're available and not loaded. It's your fault you're available and not loaded. So if you're not earning as much as you can, that's due to your own inefficiency. That belongs in the Hall of Fame of excuses. I don't know. I've heard so many different excuses over the years. The volume of freight. The volume of freight is down. So we got all these drivers that we need to even out the freight. Okay, well, why don't you do a hiring freeze? If freight's low, why don't you stop hiring people? Oh no, we got to continuously hire people. In fact, we're going to give you 1 cent per mile increase in your pay if you bring somebody on board. It's like, why would I want to bring somebody on board? Because more drivers for less loads. So I'm having trouble. You want me to bring more drivers into the organization, so now there's even less loads per driver. But this belongs in the Hall of Fame of excuses, is that there's not enough volume, but they're still recruiting. They're not doing a freeze. So when you hear these things, you always got to be skeptical. It's like, okay, I hear you, but for every side of the coin, there's a flip side of that coin too. And uh, as an owner operator, what you need to do is you just need to take charge. You're running a small business. You're going to get paid, but it's what you do with your money. It's not what you make, you know, that's important. It would be nice to make more. I'm not going to argue with you about that. It's not what you make, it's what you keep. And what you keep, what matters is what you do with what you keep. So if you are doing okay, can you grow your money financially by investing it? That's the best way to beat this game and eliminate all the excuses. It's like, I'm not going to wait for a pay increase. I'm going to take the money I have, I'm going to invest it, and I'm going to grow my money. When you get around to give me more money for a pay increase, that's nice, but I'm not holding my breath waiting for you to give me a pay increase. I've heard all the excuses. I know, understand it's not coming anytime soon. The other thing you do is cut your costs. Cut costs as much as you possibly can, and take advantage of every discount that Crete has to offer. So in essence, you could give yourself a raise. You know, the big thing about being an owner operator is that you're taking charge of your own destiny. Your fate is in your hands. If you don't like something, then it's up to you to fix it. If you don't getting paid more, what can you do to fix it? Can you invest your money? Can you grow your money? Can you take a better advantage of the discounts? Because the the top number isn't really changing a lot. The revenue per mile is not going to change. What you can change is the cost per mile. That's in your control. The revenue per mile is not really in your control. That's fixed by the company. The cost per mile, that's in your control, because you can cut those costs if you really, really try, and you can save your money and you can invest and grow it, but it's a shame you have to do all this extra to try to offset the fact that you're not getting a pay increase. But when more pay isn't coming, you got to make the best of what you have, because you could stew on that for years. I haven't seen a pay increase from Crete. I think they did 1 cent per mile about a year and a half or 2 years ago for the owner operators. They haven't done anything for the company drivers. Meanwhile, inflation's gone up. You know, it's in effect taking a pay cut. When inflation goes up and your pay doesn't go up to match inflation, you're in essence working harder for less. You're taking a pay cut. And odds are corporations are passing those costs on to their customers. In theory, that's what should happen. Customers could always say that they're not willing to pay, but it'd be upon the organization to go find better customers. You know, um, the Teamsters will always negotiate for pay increases. They'll never go a year without a pay increase. Never, absolutely never. They get pay increase. They negotiate this stuff. And if corporations came with a bunch of excuses like those that are in the Hall of Fame, the Teamsters have said, "Too bad, figure it out." you know, Teamsters are tough, and they get their pay increases. They don't care what problems the executives have. They're the ones doing the work. They're going to get paid. If you don't want to pay them, guess what? They go on strike. They go on strike for better pay, wages, and benefits. But in a non-union company, all kinds of games, they can tell tall tales. There's no one there to hold them accountable. Nobody. There's no union, and bad companies will have higher turnover. But as you see in some of these examples, they tell you you can earn more money by recruiting other drivers. So you're combating an otherwise high turnover situation for them because they're not raising pay. See, if they have a turnover problem, which all trucking companies do, Most of the turnover, most trucking companies, over 90%. I think Crete's like 50%. But if they had a turnover problem, they have to keep bringing in fresh blood, and rather than raising wages. They'd rather deal with high turnover than raise wages. That's why the trucking industry, the American Truck Association, ATA, always says every single year I've been driving, which has been 11, 12 years now, every year they're magically 80,000 drivers short. Every single year. That number never changes. And that's why you get all these foreign drivers. They cut the wages. They can work much lower wages. Um, that could improve now that it seems like the politicians have awakened to the fact that we have some non-English speaking drivers and the hazards that they bring to the industry. So I would expect some improvement in that area. But the myth of 80,000 driver shortage every year is there to suppress your wages, keep your wages down. And whenever you speak up about getting a pay increase, they roll out the Hall of Fame answers. They got an answer for everything. They have an answer for everything except a pay increase. So no matter what objections you came up with, they have an answer. They think long and hard about this. They have little board meetings, little corporate office meetings, and they talk about this every day. How do we answer this question? Some genius comes up with the idea. Oh, we'll tell them to recruit more drivers. And we'll give you 1 cent per mile increase. You're going to bring in your own competition to undercut your wages, so you'll have even less loads per driver. Yeah, bring in more drivers. That's the answer. Yeah, okay. Drive more miles. That's the answer. Oh, okay. All kinds of answers other than giving you a 3 cent per mile annual pay increase every single year that you should deserve, because inflation goes up 2 or 3% every year. Every year that you don't get a raise is another pay cut you're taking, because inflation goes up no matter what. That's why the unions and Teamsters, they don't play these games. The company's going to pay, and they make sure they pay. Every single year, those drivers get paid. It's the non-union companies that play the games. So the owner-operator business model is kind of like a strategy for drivers and for corporations. If you are not satisfied being an employee and not getting earnings, it's another excuse that belongs in the Hall of Fame of excuses. If you want to earn more money, go buy your own truck. Take on more risk. The union would say no. We're not taking on more risk just so we can earn pay that we deserve. But in a non-union trucking company, they'll tell you, go buy your own truck operator. You'll have the chance to earn more money, but you're going to do it at your own risk. So these are the games that non-unions play. And really, the owner-operator business model, independent contractor, is a union avoidance strategy for the corporation. If you have disgruntled drivers who want more pay, it's an easy out for them. It's an answer. Like I said, they come up with answers for everything. The answer is, if you're not happy being a company driver, then become an owner-operator. But don't you ever try to become a union driver. That would be a major no-no. And let me tell you something, if the drivers ever did form a union, the CEO would be fired, because that's his job, to make sure that the drivers stay non-union. So that's how important it is for the company to stay non-union. But good companies don't need a union. It's always the saying in corporate America that only the poorly run companies deserve a union. Some industries are more heavily union than others. So steel workers, it's heavily union. Railroad, heavily union. Coal miners, heavily union. Oil industry, heavy union. The heavy industry is unionized. And that used to be the true for trucking. But, since the 1980s and deregulation, the unions have been losing ground in trucking. And as the unions lost ground, wages went down. And like modern day trucking here, 2025, 45 years later after deregulation, and drivers say, we don't have pay. I guarantee you the Teamsters is looking at that and saying, no shit, Sherlock. We told you all along. You didn't listen. You know, Teamsters are getting paid. You're not getting paid. But, that was normal for the industry back in the 70s and 80s. Heavy union trucking jobs. And they all got paid. Every single year they got paid. It's these non-union trucking companies that are not paying you on an annual basis. So you can become an owner-operator and try to boost your money, and take the money you have, try to invest it and grow it. Take advantage of every discount you can get. Cut your costs per mile because your revenue per mile is not necessarily going to go up. You can drive more miles and try to get that bonus, but I think you'd be better off in a long run if you learn how to invest your money. All right, guys, that's all I got for you. Thanks for watching. We'll see you on the internet.